you all for joining us for Navigating Realities, where dialogue meets understanding. We're here with the New Jersey Attorney General, one of the great guys I've met over the years, Matt Platkin. It's a pleasure to have you here, Matt. Good to see you again.
It's awesome to be
all
with you.
All the hard work you've done through the years, and just a pleasure just to be able to chat with you.
Likewise.
Navigating Realities is something that, a podcast is really for folks to get to know who you are. We've had Senator Singleton, the speaker, just talking about 3 topics that we're not supposed to talk about, Matt. Race, religion, and politics. I think it's important that we have these discussions, right? And it's important that people get an understanding and get a feel for 3 important topics and your perspective on these 3 issues. But just talk a little bit about, talk a little bit about your life, like where you're from, where you grow up.
Well, first of all, the respect is mutual, not both for you and for this organization, Fair Share, generally. As we were just talking about, the work that's been done out of this building has changed the state in so many ways that are transformational. And for me, I grew up in Morris County. My family has been in New Jersey for a while. My grandparents raised my parents in raised my dad in Clifton and Passaic, and so Passaic County. And my mom's family was from not far from where I live now in West Orange, and my grandpa was in the Navy for his career. So we ended up in Morris County, and it was I had a great childhood. I mean, I had public school education, loved growing up here, and New Jersey was always a big part of me. I'm very grateful for what I was able to, the childhood I was able to have, the education I was able to get. It wasn't the most diverse environment. I joke, I was the Jewish kid, so I was kind of the diversity around, but a really great community, a place that really lifted me up and a lot of people around me, and that I've stayed close with.
You have siblings?
Yeah, I have an older sister. She's a teacher. She just had her second kid, so she taught in East Harlem for almost 20 years, and we're very close, very different but very close. And one older sister, and my parents are still around. Thank God.
Oh wow!
So
great. You mentioned growing up in a not so diverse community. Did race play a role in was it discussed in your home? Did you guys talk about it?
Sure, yeah, and I was always, my parents were always very big on making sure that I knew to treat everybody the same way I would be treated. That golden rule is sort of very fundamental. And, they made an effort to expose me to different things. And as I was growing up, it's sort of like, I think, a consciousness within me, both because you sort of learn some things in school, but also just a sense of trying to understand. But that was really instilled in me at home. And then there was a curiosity. I mean, I used to sneak off in lunch hour and read. We had Martin Luther King and anthologies of his speeches in my high school library. I didn't tell my friends that's what I was doing because I probably would have gotten picked on, but that's what I did. And then, really when I went to college and was sort of put in a very diverse learning environment, it was, some of the best learning experiences of my life was just sitting and talking with friends from kind of all over the country, all over the world, and learning about their lives and how at the end of the day we really were very similar.
What was the politics in your house? Was politics discussed or?
Yeah, a lot. I mean, it was dinner table stuff. My parents, they weren't involved in politics. Like I didn't know anybody in politics when I started doing this work, but they were always political in the sense that they cared about what was going on. And like I said, my grandfather was a career public servant. He was in the Navy for his entire career and then went to the Department of Energy, and he was a big presence in my life. And we didn't agree on a lot, but he was in DC for a lot of my childhood, so I would spend time down there and got to go see, all the museums and the buildings. Just being around that environment was that's really where my drive and quest or wanting to be involved in public service and do work that mattered. But it was a big part of my childhood. And then my 5th day of high school was 9/11.
Really?
And so that was sort of a moment when I think I kind of woke up to the the reality that we as a nation had been attacked, and then the debate about where the line between public safety and civil liberties lie. And then I sort of in high school, I really got engaged in work about gun violence, which is something that I'm still very passionate about. So it was, and I was encouraged. My parents never sort of forced me to take a position. They never said, you should believe this, you should. But we talked. We read the newspaper, which my dad, I vividly remember, would read cover to cover every night, and then I would sort of try to emulate him and catch up with what was going on. First with the comics, and then sports, and then eventually I cared about the news too. But it was always a big part of my childhood.
What did you remember most about 9/11? I mean, that was just the 5th day of high school, you said?
Yeah, I remember like the sense of fear. I mean, I was at Madison High School. We had a lot of folks who worked in Manhattan and commuted through the World Trade Center. And it's not, on one hand, it's a long time ago now, 20, it's almost 24 years ago. But on the other hand, it's not that long. Right. And but if you think about it, we had no cell phones, we had no internet in school. And I remember vividly sitting in the cafeteria, and one by one, the principal or a member of the staff would come and knock on the door and say, so-and-so, your parents called, they're okay, your parents called. And not everybody got that call that day, tragically. And so it was kind of the moment, and then of course, the wars started, and I had friends that went off and fought, and some who didn't make it back, at least not in the same way. And, so it was a big inflection point, I think, in my life, about understanding the role government and these decisions can affect you. And certainly when you're attacked, you sort of have this real sense of fear. I remember my grandfather, he was a nuclear engineer in the Navy, like I said, and he was staying with us, and it's like, well, if a nuclear bomb goes off in Manhattan, like, here's how far it'll have to go before it hits you. I was like, this is not helping. This is not helping. Yeah. But there was this debate and a consciousness that woke everybody up.
Wow. How did faith play a role? How did faith play? Does it play a role for you? Did it play a role?
It did, and it does. I'm Jewish. I grew up in a practicing Jewish household. We belonged to there was a small Jewish community in Florham Park where we lived, and it was a house not much bigger than this. That was my temple, about 60 families, and we would go there every Friday night, and that was sort of a community that I had. And Judaism, like most religions, or all religions really, it forces you to think about social issues and the world in a way that's critical. And so I really enjoyed that, and I think part of the reason why I became a lawyer is because I sort of enjoyed that form of debate and critical thinking. But it was always a big part of my life, and now we're raising our kids. My wife's Chinese, but our kids are being raised Jewish, and in a very different type of synagogue. I grew up sort of more on the observant end of conservative movement. We're now in a Reform synagogue, but it still plays a big part of my life, and both from a religious perspective, but also just in sort of trying to understand things that are happening around us, and realizing that what we're going through, it feels new to us, but in the history of the world, there's a lot of ways you can relate. And I've studied in college. I studied a lot of other religions and have engaged. We're having we hosted the first ever iftar from my office last year. Wow. The second one is tonight. And I've always found that there's so much commonality across religions, and I have faith leaders across the spectrum that I call on a regular basis and seek their advice and counsel. And so religion continues to play a big role in my life, and it really helps ground me.
Yeah. It's so funny. You do call me periodically, and I'm like, why is he calling me? I can't offer him anything.
That's not true.
but let's talk a little bit about, because I'm curious, was it a moment that led you into law enforcement? What made you want to go to be an attorney? To be an attorney,
I wanted to help people. And, I graduated college. I actually thought I was going to join the Foreign Service. Really? I had studied Chinese in college, and that was sort of where I was going. And then Barack Obama got elected president, and we were in the middle of the Great Recession. the worst financial crisis we
Yeah.
had seen. And so you talk about two events that shaped me. It was sort of 9/11 on the front end in high school, and then the Great Recession and the collapse on Wall Street, and the subprime mortgage crisis, and how many people got hurt. Those two things really shaped me, and it sort of said, okay, I want to be involved in public service. So I was graduating college, and I took a teaching job for a couple months over the summer.
I didn't know that. You taught?
It was a summer teaching gig, but the reason why I did it was to save enough money so I could go to Washington. I didn't know anybody in D.C. I didn't know anything about politics. I wanted to work. I said I wanted to go work for Barack Obama. Now, there were a lot of people who said that.
Yeah.
So I moved to D.C. with no job. My mom really loved that. And
so wait a minute. You picked up and moved to D.C. without a job.
No job. And all my friends were making all this money, and I was like, I'm going to go to Washington. And so I took the money I saved from teaching, and I rented a small apartment, and I was sort of interning around while I was applying for jobs. And so I quickly realized, I wasn't going to work in the White House. There were a lot of people who wanted that, so I said, maybe I'll go work. I wanted to work on Capitol Hill, and there were 60. I'm a Democrat. There were 60 Democrats in the Senate and a significant majority in the House, so I applied to every single office.
Really?
Didn't get an interview. So then I was like, I was never going to admit to my mom that I couldn't get a job. Like, that was not happening. So I applied to think tanks and started and sort of spread it around, and ended up getting an offer to work at the Brookings Institution, which was like basically being paid to be in school. And while I was there, it was a great experience. I was doing a lot of work on Capitol Hill on economic recovery and sort of how do we get people back to work. My friend called me from San Antonio, Texas, and he was going to run for city council. And so I was just like, well, if you run, I'll run your campaign. Had never been to San Antonio and had never run a campaign. It's to this day the only campaign that I've ever run. And so I moved into his mom's house. I made no money, but we spent that year knocking on doors and talking to people. And on the one hand, it was a nonpartisan race, so it was like you could really feel what government was about. Like you could see the impact, especially local government, sixth largest city in the country, incredibly diverse city, the first city with a Latino mayor, a minority Latino mayorship in that city, and it was really an eye-opening experience just to listen to people, and also eye-opening because of the amount of corruption that I saw. And so it was after that experience that I said, you know what, like I'm going to go to law school, and I'm going to work to make sure that government delivers for people like the great people that I saw in San Antonio and then I knew back home.
Wow. I didn't know you did all that, moving to D.C. with no money and then running a campaign. Your campaign? I didn't know you're a campaign person, right?
I'm not really, but it was, like I said, it was my best friend from college, so we were just, and he was supposed to lose. He was like, we didn't know. We were
he
20. Won? He ended up winning, and he ended up winning against basically the wife of the incumbent who was supported. The one person, and we love Julian Castro now, but the one person that he got engaged in the race for to support anybody was our opponent. We got out fundraised. We got no endorsements.
Wow.
But he worked and he talked to people, and and we listened, and we came in with all these big ideas of things we wanted to talk about. And you know what the number one issue was on that campaign?
What was that?
Stray dogs.
Really?
Because there were stray dogs everywhere, and I'll tell you, like, if you leave your house to go to school or go to work and you're getting mauled by a stray dog, you don't care about anything else.
Right.
And so that was a lesson. I tell that story in our office. Like, we have to make sure that we're listening and responding to what people care about. Even, I'm not in an elected office, but we serve the public. And that's the difference between our system of government and every other system of government. We have to care.
Yeah, let's talk about listening, because you've done a lot of listening sessions around the state, and your work around police reform has been, pretty freaking incredible. Take a lot of hit and criticism for it. Like, what is it about, and you know this because of all the reports that was issued, the racial bias that exists in policing. What are your thoughts about that? What made you come to the place, one, to really focus on really trying to revamp the state police, and what has been some of the challenges around it?
Look, I think as a general matter, we have, and this is, I think, almost indisputable, we have the best trained law enforcement officers in the country. We have 42,000 cops. Only state in the country that trained everyone on bystander intervention, de-escalation training. We are the first state to have body-worn cameras deployed throughout the state, thanks in partnership with both the advocacy and the law enforcement community and the legislature and the governor. As you know, we're the only state that presents every fatal police encounter to the grand jury, which is complicated work that my office oversees. And you know, we're the first state in the country that embraced how to respond to mental health crises differently, and we now are the only state with a statewide program responding to mental health calls with a clinical approach. We've now helped thousands and thousands of people and eliminated injuries in the cases that are most likely to result in injury or arrest. Look, we know that there, in this country, and New Jersey is no exception, there has been disparities in how certain communities have been treated, and race plays a role. And I think if we pretend that doesn't exist, then we, which is, I think, unfortunately what you hear now, today, out of Washington, it's a recipe for bad outcomes. And so, you know, I've been really proud that in New Jersey, like, I've been able to find really strong partners in law enforcement. It's not about, for the most part, saying like you're doing something wrong. It's about how do we do things better. And so, like, take police licensing. We were the 46th state in the country to have any kind of license or certification for law enforcement. I don't think that's a great badge of honor, but we now have the strongest police licensing program in the country, one that I stood with the president of the PBA and announced support for. And why did they support it? Because just like as a lawyer, I'm licensed, and you know, people know, okay, your license is in good standing, that means something. Well, the vast majority of officers who are doing great work every day and who care, their reputation is hurt when somebody does something and is allowed, that's bad, and is allowed to continue to wear the badge. And so I think there was a recognition, and I supported this, that we got to lift up the standards and show that there's a qualification for it. So licensing was a big piece of it. But look, you know, law enforcement has a tough job, and I understand. They answer every call no matter what it comes in, and I understand it's natural when you take criticism, as I'm pretty used to taking. You know, it can be frustrating, and you feel underappreciated. And I think both things can be true. It is absolutely true that we've asked law enforcement to do far too much in this country. We have underinvested in other services, which means 911 is what people call. And in a relatively few number of cases, those calls have gone badly, and they've caused real harm, and people were hurt. It is also true that we can do things better, and we Arrive Together, the mental health program that I talked about. We had a study done which showed not only did it eliminate injuries and improve mental health outcomes, but it eliminated racial disparities in these calls. Because we know that, look, Black and brown communities also lack access. It's not just law enforcement. They lack access to health care, certainly mental health care. And so who are they disproportionately to call when they're having an emotional disturbance? They're going to call 911. And so if we can bring the mental health into this response, we can both address that person's healthcare issues, but as a larger issue, we can help reduce some of the mental health disparities and build trust in law enforcement. So it's doing multiple things at once.
Why do you think it took so long for, you know, I guess as a society or even industry and law enforcement and legal field to embrace the mental health aspect of it? We know a large part of this is, some of it is mental health, some of it is the social conditions, right? What do you think what took us so long to get there? And I mean, we're already making some strides. You mentioned around this issue. What more can we do around the mental health piece?
We have a lot. I think it's only relatively recently that we even acknowledge mental health as something that people deal with. Look, you know, if you have a stomach bug, nobody's ashamed to say, like, hey, I have the flu. But if you're dealing with a bout of depression, there was this real fear of sort of saying it, the stigma surrounding that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, my wife's a psychologist, and like I said, she's Chinese, and her parents didn't even understand what she was doing. And yet, when she became a psychologist, she started getting a lot of calls from family members and friends who didn't know how to deal with their kids who were suffering, and suddenly it was like, oh, this is actually something we can help address.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, and for people who are lower income and who don't have access to health care in this country the way they should, and mental health is unfortunately behind even some physical access to physical health care. We just don't have enough mental health professionals, period. And people still aren't conditioned to seek that help, which is something that I've really been trying to drive. You know, I think this is all relatively recent, unfortunately. Why did it take so long? I don't have a perfect answer to that, but I know that, yes, 2/3 of all uses of force in the state of New Jersey by a law enforcement officer involve somebody suffering from a mental health challenge.
Wow.
And so the fact that we've been able to eliminate force in over 7,000 calls now and eliminate injuries, keeping officers safe, keeping civilians safe, getting them the health care they need, building trust. That's why I'm so excited about this program, and we're now serving 64% of the state's population, the 15 largest cities, all 21 counties. And as we scale this up and as we build in new models, we've been able to do different things. So originally it was just mental health care providers responding to calls with plainclothes police officers in unmarked cars. They were responding together. Now there's enough trust that we're able to see through dispatch and other ways, okay, this call really doesn't need a law enforcement response at all. And we can dispatch a social worker, or we can have a mental health professional go. Handle those calls safely, they're not at risk, and let law enforcement officers focus on the work that they really should be doing. And so I think we're going to see this continue to progress. It's an issue that it doesn't know partisan grounds. It doesn't, law enforcement loves it, community loves it, the mental health providers are getting the respect and participation that they deserve. And so, I think we can continue to grow it and ultimately continue to help people and save lives.
Let's talk about a piece of legislation that Fairshire Housing Center was instrumental in United Black Agenda getting, that your office oversees, the Fair Chance in Housing Act.
Yeah.
It is the strongest statewide law in the country that limits the use of criminal background checks for returning citizens. This was something that was pretty amazing that we got to work on. Actually, Supreme Court Justice Rachel Ackler Weaver was a part of that, working in your office before she became a Supreme Court Justice. And I think one of the incredible things about that piece of legislation, the big struggle was who was going to oversee this, and we settled on getting it overseen by the Attorney General's office. And you guys have been doing some great work. And talk a little bit about that piece of legislation, why it's important for returning citizens to get a fair chance in getting housing.
Well, first of all, you did, as always, with your colleagues, amazing advocacy to get that done. You said the strongest. I think we're still the only, but maybe which makes you the strongest. But it's so important, and I said this when I came into office. We have really strong laws in New Jersey. We do, and I'm proud of that. But if laws don't get enforced, then they're words on a paper. They're just a press release, and that should not be the case. And so, when I came in, I really wanted, our whole department, but especially our civil rights division, to focus on enforcing the strong laws that we had. One of which is the Fair Chance in Housing Act. As you mentioned, it came into effect right as I was taking office at the start of 2022. And so we put a team in place dedicated to enforcing that law. And we've done hundreds of enforcement actions now. And we've partnered with places with apps like Trulia and Zillow and Apartments.com. And so now, not only are we enforcing it, but their algorithms are proactively taking down advertisements that say, if you have a criminal history, no need to apply. Things like that, which are blatant violations of the law. Why is it important? Obviously, it's important for that individual. We know that housing is arguably the single biggest predictor in whether or not somebody can successfully integrate to society after they've had a term of incarceration. So it's incredibly important for that individual. But it's also important for everybody, because if we want, and we should all want, people when they've served their time to come back and be productive members of society, then letting them, we're not talking about a handout. The law doesn't say it's free.
Right.
They're entitled to use whatever source of income they legally have, whether that be they're from a job or from government assistance or whatever it be. And the studies show it's not like they're going to cause significantly greater harm.
Right.
They're going to do the same things everybody who does who's right. They're going to mostly pay their bills the same way most people do. They're going to be good members of the community. And when and that roof over their head is what is often the difference between whether or not they will stay as a productive member of society or they'll end up, recidivating. And so what we should do is encourage that type of policy that makes sense. I've talked a lot about this for folks on pretrial release. We know that, again, think about it. If you don't have a roof over your head, and if you have kids and you don't have a roof over your head, you're not creating an environment for somebody that is going to be productive. And so I think the law has been hugely impactful. We've said very clearly we're going to enforce it. And, I'm still waiting for the first call from somebody who said, hey, I had to rent it to this person because of the Fair Chance and Housing Act. And, they destroyed my apartment. We haven't gotten any of those complaints.
Yeah.
And we're 3 years in. And we've had a lot of people successfully reintegrating into society in a way that helps everybody.
What would you say going into law enforcement, what you know now that you didn't know then, surprised you or encourage you, or right now still saying, wow, we got a lot of work to do?
I think both. The same answer for both, rather. So like I said, in high school, the first issue I really got engaged on was gun violence. And it's been a lifelong passion for me, and will continue to be, because I'm raising now 2 kids, grew up in the Columbine generation and thought we would have solved this problem, and now I'm raising 2 kids in a country where the single greatest cause of death for children is a firearm. No country that looks like us anywhere in the world can say the same. So on the one hand, surprising is not the right word, but the devastation caused by gun violence, I've never been grown numb to that. I've spent far too much time with victims of gun violence. My second month on the job, we had a 9-year-old girl who wanted to be a law enforcement officer, Sequoia Bacon-Jones, shot and killed while playing hide and seek in the courtyard of her apartment complex about a mile from my office.
Wow.
And I spent a lot of time with her mom. I obviously watched the evidence in that case. I watched this little girl, and you never forget that.
Yeah.
On the other hand, that's what drives me. But on the other hand, what has encouraged me is I've seen the progress we can make. So 2 years running now, we've had the lowest number of shootings on record in New Jersey history.
Wow, really?
2 years ago, we came in and said, we're going to have under 1,000 shootings. People literally laughed at us. We had 124. Last year, we said we were going to get under 900. Again, people laughed at us. We were under 800.
Wow.
And how did that happen? It happened because we've focused our law enforcement efforts in a really intelligent way by seeing who's really driving violence, not dragging that through whole communities and wasting resources, which also has huge racial disparities. But there's about 1,000 people who are serially involved in violence, and so we focused on them. But we didn't just if you just focus on the law enforcement lens, we're not going to solve this problem. So we also invested heavily, as you know, and I thank the governor and the legislature for this, in community-based organizations that can reach kids, mostly kids, but also young adults that are caught up in cycles of violence, and prevent that cycle from continuing. Reach them in a way that someone with a badge is just never going to be able to do. And I've spent time with these. I've lost push-up contests on street corners with our violence intervention teams. I've gone to more events with them, walks, and seen the impact that they have and talked to them. Now, can I point to a single shooting that hasn't happened because of a conversation that somebody in our violence intervention team has? No, that's impossible. But I know that the decline, which happens to coincide with our increase in violence intervention work, is not an accident. And the third thing we've done is something I think is kind of basic. The same way, and when the opioid manufacturers preyed on whole communities, we sued them and they have to pay for their harms. Well, we created the first office of its kind in the country to hold the gun industry accountable.
Wow.
For profiting off of violence in our communities. So when Glock sells a handgun that can be within a couple minutes turned into a machine gun, and they know it, and they sit in Austria and profit off of violence in communities like New Jersey, we filed, along with Minnesota, the largest lawsuit ever filed against a gun manufacturer. We sued a gun show just across the river that was openly selling ghost guns into New Jersey.
Wow.
And so all of this working together has driven violence down to historically low levels, and knock on wood, we are even below this year where we were last year.
Wow.
And so, I'm encouraged by that, because there are times, when I saw the tragedy in Trenton, Sequoia, when you see some of the mass shootings, it can make you feel hopeless.
Yeah.
And don't get me wrong, there are real challenges, and this United States Supreme Court has not made it any easier, but we're still seeing progress because we're thinking about it in a holistic way, in a public health way. The same way we attack an epidemic, we got to attack this.
It's so funny because just today on the way here, I was listening to the news. Mexico is suing Smith & Wesson because of the illegal guns that are flooding in Mexico. How did those lawsuits come about? You sued some of the manufacturers. Have they been successful? How does that work?
We have had successes. So we've sued more. In 1 year, we sued more gun companies for violating state laws and hurting our residents than any state has sued in their history.
Wow.
Now, part of that is not their fault. In 2005, the gun lobby went to Congress and got protection that no other industry has from lawsuits in federal court. President Bush signed it into law. No other industry, not tobacco, not opioids, not automobiles, not airplanes. No other industry has that level of protection in federal court. But you're allowed to bring lawsuits in state courts. So we said we're going to have an office that's dedicated to doing it. It's part of our public safety effort. And I went to every AG in the country and asked them to join a coalition, and got 18 or 19 to join us in this coalition, so we can bring them in multi-state cases and go across state lines. And this is, important, I think, going back to our conversation before. I spent a lot of time, as you noted, in the community. I've never heard anybody say, when I go to a community, that they want more gun violence. And the first time I go to a community that says, hey, I want more violence, will be the first time that I hear that. But you also, there's a lot of talk now, you asked this question earlier about, okay, well, can you combat violence while also making sure that people are treated with respect? I said that's a false choice. It's a false choice, because when people feel that they have trust in their law enforcement, when they feel respected, when they know when they pick up the phone and have somebody at the other end who's got their back, they're more likely to go to law enforcement, to seek their help. And that's obvious. If you picked up the phone and called somebody and felt like you were going to be hurt or not helped, would you pick up the phone and call them?
Absolutely not.
The answer is no. And so the middle of that Venn diagram is actually much bigger than people think, where you have people feel respected and people want to be safe. That's not, those two things are not mutually exclusive. They're core principles. And I think when we've gotten that right, because we've gotten that right and pushed New Jersey, by the way, with broad support from law enforcement, don't believe everything you read, we've been able to make people safer. And so I really believe that in this moment we need to say that, because it is a false choice that people are being presented with.
Yeah. When you think about the times you spent in these communities, what have you learned about being in these, predominantly communities of color, Black, Latino, poor communities? What have you learned being in these communities that you didn't know prior to doing this type of stuff?
I mean, we live in the most diverse state in the country on many measures. Since I left home for college, I think my career has been a series of opportunities where I've gotten to learn from. I've learned so much more from spending time in Black churches across the state than I've been able to teach them, and how rich these communities are, and how welcoming and how similar.
Mm-hmm.
It's how similar. Like we talked about religion. You go to my synagogue, and you go to a Baptist church, and you go to a church in a Latino community, or you go to a mosque in Somerset, or a Hindu temple, or whatever it may be. When you strip away the sort of facial differences, we're all kind of seeking the same thing. We're trying to understand the same challenges, and we're approaching things from very, very similar perspectives. And so I think so much of what we're seeing now and the divisiveness in this country is a product of the fact that people are engaging less than they probably ever have. Because you can now get your news and your worldview filtered through an algorithm created by Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg, and never leave your house.
Yeah.
And so when you go out and you listen and you engage and you talk to people, we're not that different. That's been true forever. We've manufactured a lot of differences to divide people. And I feel in this job that I have an obligation to make sure people see me, that they hear me, that they see my team, that they see who works in law enforcement, and if I can, in some small way, help shape their view about like how law enforcement in this state thinks, just by showing up and listening, then that's part of what my obligation as the chief law enforcement officer of this state is.
You know, it's interesting because consistently on this podcast, many of the guests have a very similar listening. That keeps coming back as a running theme. We need to listen more because of the political climate that we're in today. I don't know how it's going to get any better with the currents. And this is not politics for me. I'm independent, but a person who's in office who thrives off of divisiveness and division, I don't know it's going to get any better while this person's in office. New Jersey has an opportunity in the coming months to elect a new governor. You served under Governor Murphy for quite a while. What would you say in terms of who's coming into office? What would you say advice in terms around law enforcement, or they get to pick a AG, right? What would you say, like what should a new governor be looking for in an attorney general?
Well, I'm very lucky that I get to be in a non-political job while that's going on, and so my primary focus is making sure that the election is fair and safe, and that the expansive opportunities to vote, which with partnership with that many advocates we've put in place over the past several years. We've expanded access to the ballot, which I think is a good thing. I created the first ever election integrity program where we have people in my office that are just making sure people can go out and exercise their right to vote. We sued a county last election because they were not providing adequate access to voting, and they needed to extend their hours. And we'll continue to do that work. Look, I'm very proud of what we've done over the past 3 years, and I'm proud of the way the office has functioned throughout the Murphy administration, and I'm proud of the really bipartisan legacy of our office. We are meant to be independent. I've taken that independence seriously. It doesn't always win me a lot of friends, and so I think that the most important thing for whoever comes into this office next, or 30 years or 50 years or 300 years from now, is take that responsibility seriously. There is one chief law enforcement officer in the state. We have a unified system of law enforcement, which allows us to be very thoughtful about how we ensure public safety. It allows us to implement necessary reforms uniformly and swiftly. And it requires somebody to take tough decisions, to make tough decisions. And the history of my office was that it was created after a series of exposés in the 60s, about corruption and mafia influence in government. And that's still a challenge. And I think right now in this moment, people very much feel like their government, regardless of where you are on the political spectrum, this is overwhelmingly the sense that their government isn't working for them. And they're not always wrong about that. And so whoever comes in, I hope they take that responsibility seriously. Yes, that relates to public corruption, but just generally saying, look, I'm going to do what I think is right, and that's it. And that's the beauty of the job I have. Is I'm not elected. I don't have to worry about politics. You can just do what you think is right. And, if I don't think what you're doing is right, so be it. As long as you are making those decisions through that prism, that I think is what's important. And I hope that the work that we've done continues to, ensure, to lower gun violence and protect kids and protect communities.
I mean, one of the things, the surprising things, more like, the office, the Division of Civil Rights is an incredible office that you oversee, and it's done some incredible work. I don't know how many New Jerseyans know about the Division of Civil Rights, and I think we need to do more in the advocate space, referring people to the Office of the Division of Civil Rights. And I think, the work you've done around, police reform, all the hits you've taken around. And I think it's important that if you're going to be in a position, it's not about, how to get to power or get to a certain position. The question is, what do you do when you get there? And I applaud you, Matt, because you've taken a lot of risk, and I think, I tell people all the time that one of the greatest presidents this country has ever seen was LBJ. How can you say that? Because of the war, and he was a segregationist. But I say, what did he do when he had power? What did he do? Always the question for me, when you're in a position to change people's lives, how do you respond to that? And this country have probably had eight significant civil rights pieces of legislation, 8 real significant civil rights laws that was passed. LBJ passed 4 of them, 4 out of the 8. And so for me, when I see a person, regardless of their political background, their beliefs, what do they do when they're in position to change people's lives? What risk are they willing to take? And you've taken some risks, man. And I think that's, your legacy as Attorney General is a legacy that has taken risks, particularly around policing. And look, we're not going to solve this issue. Policing, racism, and I'm not saying about all cops by no means. Like, when I need a cop, when something's going on in my neighborhood, I'm calling. That's who I'm calling. But this pervasiveness that exists around racism, I think you've tried to attack it as much as you can, and I think I applaud you for that. And what advice would you give for people who, law enforcement, like, how do we overcome this issue? How do we get past this issue? The mental health stuff you're doing is great, all those things. How do we get the law enforcement to really understand the humanity of people of color and not be afraid, one, when they go in these communities, and 2, the respect and dignity that everyone deserves? And you've worked on that, but what do you think the next steps are for this, man?
Yeah, look, I think we're continuing to make progress. And I know how we don't get better is pretending that it doesn't exist. And so, this attack now on DEI, DEI stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. Like, those are core principles of America. You mentioned the 8 civil rights laws, but those are literally the core principles of the 14th Amendment, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, which, as you know, we fought a civil war before we got them. And so, I think, look, when I got nominated, I talked about a phrase in Judaism, tzedek, tzedek tirdof, which means justice, justice shalt thou pursue, that you should pursue justice. And I have that actually framed in my office. And, I like that phrase, and it's been debated for centuries about what it really means. But to me, the use of the word pursuit is really important, because, look, I have this job for 4 years, and and I'm privileged to have had this opportunity, and I'm very proud of the work that we did. We're not going to accomplish justice. We're not going to complete it. We're not going to perfect it. No one is going to do that. And I'm reminded of that every day when I go into my office. You do what you think is right. you try to push the ball forward, you try to pursue justice. And if you did that day, whatever was presented to you, if you felt like you made the decisions that were in the pursuit of justice, then however the cards fall, so be it. Because you made decisions based on what you thought was right. And I think the more we can instill folks to take that approach, the better we'll be, not just in law enforcement, but in everything. And part of that is not pretending that things exist, that things that do exist don't exist.
Right.
Race exists. Like it's just a fact. And when we try to bring people together instead of tearing them apart, the negative consequences of the way people view race can be diminished. And we can see, as we've talked about, the way law enforcement in many instances in this state, and law enforcement, like no profession, is not perfect.
Right.
But they have embraced change in a lot of ways, and we've seen benefits from it. I talk about Arrive Together a lot because it's a great example. It's very simple. Just bringing two different sets of services that were not talking to each other together and responding in a more enlightened way. Investing in community-based organizations.
That's a bit
really important. Showing, for decades we just said the community was over here and law enforcement's got this. Well, it turns out when we talk to people with credibility on the street, in the community, you know what? And we empower them. They want their communities to be safer too.
Hell
and
yeah.
they can be helpful in making everybody safer.
Yeah, I think that's important. Two last questions. One, but if a young person who's want to get into law enforcement or go to law school, or what advice would you give them?
I think it can be an incredibly noble and impactful career. You can get into it because you want to help people. And I'll give them the same advice that one of my professors gave me that I talk about a lot, which is she used to say, courage is a muscle. So you talked about doing things that, maybe have some risk. Well, if you're an athlete, you don't just show up on game day.
No.
You think Michael Jordan picked up a basketball for the first? And I'm not comparing myself to Michael Jordan, just to be clear for everybody out there, as I'm sitting next to the Michael Jordan of dressing over here. But he didn't pick up a basketball for the first time at Game 6 in the NBA Finals. He practiced.
Yeah.
And for a lawyer, your job is we are called advocates for a reason.
Yeah.
And I'm sitting in an office where some of the finest advocates in New Jersey and this nation's history have worked, where they've pushed for real change and used the law to create that change. And at the end of the day, if you want real change, it's going to come through a legal process. It's going to come through new law. It's going to come from a lawsuit. It's going to come from some kind of administrative action. Those are the three ways to make lasting change in this country. But the ingredient to make those changes is being willing to stand up. That's not unique to lawyers, but I think for really effective lawyers, you have to be comfortable being a little bit uncomfortable. And the way you build that up is by practicing.
Yeah.
And she used to say, sitting on the fence is not practice for standing up. Take positions.
Yeah.
Don't be so afraid of being wrong or how you'll be received that you don't stand for anything.
Yeah, that's so true. One of the last things we ask our guests here on Navigating Realities, what is one of your favorite quotes and why?
Jeez, well, I just used two of my favorite ones, so I'm running low here. Look, there's a great book by Thurston Clark called The Last Campaign. It's a short book. It's just about the 100 days that Bobby Kennedy ran for presidency in '68, shortly before he was assassinated. And Bobby Kennedy, I believe, is still the last senator to go meaningfully engage at the Mississippi Delta, one of the poorest parts of this nation. And he came back from a visit, and he had his kids sitting around the table. One of them fell very far from the tree, and says to them, I was waiting for you to get there.
Yeah, I got it.
And says to them, do you have any idea how lucky you are? Do something for your country.
Yeah.
And he talks about how politics and government is meant to help people who are in trouble.
Yeah.
And you can talk about all kinds of different things, but I think about that a lot. It's at the end of the day, what we are entrusted with doing is helping people, and helping people who need government, especially. And I think if you think about that for whatever role you play in government, if that's how you ground yourself, you won't make bad decisions.
That's great, man. Thank you so much for being on Navigating Realities, where dialogue meets understanding. This is opportunity to say thank you, for all the work you've done, the risks you've taken. I think we have to be risk takers when we're trying to make change. You talk about athletes and stuff. One of the things that I always try to study athletes, and we're wrapping up. Well, I'm always trying to study athletes who, they're like, what keeps them, like, how do they get to greatness? Like I was watching Tom Brady in the arena. All these LeBron James, all these athletes.
He's a Jets fan, Tom Brady.
Yeah, I know. The Eagles had to deal with all that nonsense. And I think about the Eagles and how, they were singular focus.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes distractions gets us off course. And you think about how these folks are, ladies and women and men, and achieve these great feats. Practice, repetitive practice of being focused on getting to the peak of where they want to be in that athletic field, winning a Super Bowl, winning a championship, whatever it is. Kobe Bryant talked about this too. It's not about the destination, it's about the journey. Mm-hmm. What are you learning during that course? What are you learning about people? What are you learning about yourself? Mm-hmm. How far can you push yourself? I asked that question, I think about that question for myself. How far can I push myself to do justice, to love mercy, and be humble? And sometimes it doesn't always work out. Man. But I tell you, man, it's like thinking about some of my favorite folks in the industries, and I'm a big hip hop fan. I'm a big Jay-Z. I think Jay-Z's the GOAT. Mm-hmm. He's the only one who wrote a new book, and it's really just the Book of Hope. Mm-hmm. Psalms 51, 151, and just to being singular focus and using your talents and skills that we all have. I think Don E. Camp was one of the first folks we interviewed here, and he always reminded me that he's an artist. We're all artists. We all are creative beings. And we have this creativity is in us to do good things, to show beauty, to show, to express life in ways that are different from others. And that's not a threat to somebody else. That's not a threat to someone else's culture. It's not a threat to someone else's sexuality. It's like all this bullshit that exists when we talk about having human connections. Fair Share Housing Center here. During my 10 years as deputy director, I created the theory of change and took our staff through the theory of change. And at the time, my son was going through some things in college, and I had to do my personal. I said, what is my personal theory of change? You know what I came up with, Matt? It was like my race, my religion, my gender, my sexuality, my profession. All these things inform who I am, but it doesn't define who I am. What defines me is how do I treat what I do for others? Mm. How am I connected to another human species? What do I do with it? What defines me is my connection to another human being, because we're a species that have one common thing. We're human, and there's human compassion and connection. Before AI takes over, because we're in trouble. The Matrix is coming. That really defines who we are, as our connection to the other humanity of a person. And that gets lost in all different industries and all different aspects of life. Getting folks, to your point, and the other folks who are here listening, that's reconnecting to the other human species, regardless of who they love, what their politics is. It's like all this bullshit that distracts us from how do I connect with that person on a human level in spite of what I may agree or disagree with them about. Mm-hmm. We can disagree, and that's what I love what the speaker said about the polarism in the country. He said in New Jersey we don't have it as much because if we get to know a person, it's harder to distrust their motives when we know a person. And over the years, we've talked time and time. You'll call me up, and I just appreciate just wanting to connect on a human level to try to understand where you're coming from, why this report is hard hitting. But yeah, you know, you have someone's back when you know where they're coming from. So I just want to let you know I appreciate you, man.
Appreciate
I
you
really
too.
did. Thanks a lot, man. That's a wrap. If you can't respect that, your whole perspective is whack. And would you love me when I think the clock?